All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we'll be talking about chapters 13 and 14 of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. It's important to remember that in the frame story here, we now have Robert Walton, who's telling the story of Victor Frankenstein, who's now telling the story told to him by the monster. Remember, the monster had isolated Victor up in the mountains, taken him into this cave, and said, Victor, you must hear my story. And we know, of course, that at the end of the story, the monster is going to ask something of Victor. And so the monster gets into his story, talking about escaping from Victor's apartment, his rambles through the forest in Germany, all the lessons he had learned, and finally the monster finds this hovel. This hovel is important, obviously. It's like a little cave, and in the back of the cave, a hut is built into it. And so the key is the monster can hide in the cave, can live in this cave. No one knows that he is there. And in the back of this cave, there is a little crevice, a little hole in the wall that he can look through. And by looking through it, he can see into the hut and he can observe this family that is living there. And the family that's living there, of course, is DeLacy and his family. And of course, it opens up a lot of questions. Number one, DeLacy is obviously a French name. So you have to ask yourself, what is this French family doing living in the middle of the German forest, living in poverty with a monster in the back of their house? But they're obviously suffering greatly. And the monster observes this. And the monster really instantly starts to fall in love with this family. He wants to be part of them. He's like, they're such nice people. DeLacy, the old man, is this blind old man. Felix and Agatha are really nice people. The monster, he starts to refer to them in the text as my cottagers. When I think back about my cottagers, and the fact that he refers to them as my cottagers tells you what the monster wants here. He wants family. He wants to be accepted. Every time he has approached humans, they've run from him. They've thrown things at him. Um, we have that scene in 12 where he sees himself in a pool of water. He looks down into a pool of water and he sees himself. In all of his rambles, he realizes that he's alone. There are no other monsters. There are no monsters. He's not human. He doesn't fit in with the rest. He's met birds and deer and all these other animals, but he's met no one like him. He is truly alone. He truly is a monster. And as we move into chapter 13, he continues to look through that crevice, continue to observe the family. In chapter 13, we have the arrival of Safie. The family is very sad and despondent until it was a lady on horseback accompanied by a countryman as a guide. The lady was dressed in a dark suit and covered with a thick black veil. Agatha asked a question to which the stranger replied by pronouncing, in a sweet accent, the name of Felix. Her voice was musical, but unlike that of either of my friends. On hearing this word, Felix came up to the lady, and when she saw him, threw up her veil, and I beheld a countenance of angelic beauty and expression. Her hair was of a shining raven black and curiously braided, but her eyes were dark and gentle, although animated, her features of regular proportion, and her complexion wondrously fair, each cheek tinged with a lovely pink. So here arrives Safie, and it's obvious from the start here that Safie has a relationship with Felix, which is interesting because Safie is not French. DeLacy, Agatha, and Felix are all French people living in Germany here, and here arrives this Arabian woman. I will tell you, she is from Turkey. She is of a darker skin. She just doesn't look like them. And so, of course, the question you should have is, how does she know this family? We have a French family living poor in the middle of the woods in Germany, and here comes this Turkish Arabian woman who obviously has a relationship with Felix. But obviously, this cheers Felix up. He's super excited to meet her. He refers to her. Let's see here. This part here, he called her, as well as I could distinguish, his sweet Arabian. Notice how he refers to her. He sees Safie and he's like, oh, there's my sweet Arabian, which could just be a term of endearment. But, by referring to her as his sweet Arabian, it's almost like this reinforces that theme in this text about men controlling women, the trafficking of women that I've talked about before, how women are passed from one man to another. Notice how he refers to her. There's my Arabian, there's my darling, as if he owns her in some way. Just like Victor at the end of chapter 1, Elizabeth, there's mine. She was mine to love, hold, and protect. It's this overarching theme that we see in this text of women being objects being controlled by men. So Safie comes to live with the family here. And during this time, one of the problems here is that Safie doesn't speak French. She's from Turkey. She doesn't speak the same language as DeLacy and his family. And so they come up with this plan. She is endeavoring to learn their language. So every day, Felix and Agatha go out to make a living, to go out, work, or do whatever they do. But by day, when they're gone, Safie sits in the house with the blind old man DeLacy, and DeLacy starts to teach her the language. And the monster instantly picks up on this, and he's like, you know what? I, as he says here, could make use of the same instruction to the same end. And so day by day, for several years, Safie sits in that house with DeLacy. DeLacy teaches her how to read, how to write, how to speak, teaches her about history. He essentially becomes her teacher. And day by day, the monster sits in his hovel, listens in, and engages in the same education. If you ask yourself, how is it that this monster becomes educated when we meet him up in the mountains in chapter 10? How is it that he has learned to speak and read and write? Here is your answer. And so he does, day by day. The monster starts to learn. The days now pass more peaceably as before, with the sole alteration that joy had taken place of sadness in the countenance of my friends. Safie was always gay and happy, and she and I improved rapidly in the knowledge of language, so that in 2 months I began to comprehend most of the words uttered by my protectors. Within 2 months, the monster starts to understand their language. He hears their stories. He even brags in here at the one point. He even boasts. He's like, I may boast that I improved more rapidly than the Arabian, who understood very little. He even brags at one point to Victor. He's like, you know what? Safie and I were both learning, and I was the better student. I learned quicker than her. And as they learn, one of the ways they learn is they start to teach her to read and write by reading books to her. Felix instructed her using a book called Volney's Ruins of Empires. This is a history book, Volney's Ruins of the Empires. And it's basically a history book that tells stories of ancient empires, about the Romans and the Greeks and the Asiatics, and it tells all of these famous empires. And so while Safie is learning to read, and the monster through that is learning to read, the monster is also learning about human history. He starts to learn about humans and what humans are like, the violent wars, the Greek and Roman empires. He starts to he learns, as he talks about here, of the decline of that mighty empire of chivalry, Arthurian legend, of Christianity, and of kings. I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere and wept with Safie over the hapless fate of its original inhabitants. We even here have an allusion to American Indians, right? And so the monster is learning about human history, about empires rising and falling, about conquest and crusades. And the reference to the American Indians is not by accident. I want to remind you that Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the mother to Mary Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft was friends with Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams, who was the wife of the second president of the United States. And one of the things that Abigail Adams and Mary Wollstonecraft would write about when they conversed with each other was about the settlement of the United States and the poor things that were happening to the American Indians. And so, and we know that Mary Shelley, of course, came into possession of all these letters. And so, given the fact that her mother spent so much time talking to Abigail Adams about the American Indians and their plight, it's not surprising here that her daughter, Mary Shelley, in her novel includes this little reference to the American Indians. Like, they learned about the American Indians, what happened to them, and they wept over what happened to these poor American Indians. So that should not be a surprise to us. They go on here. Let's see here. The monster, for a long time I could not conceive how one man could go forth and murder his fellow, or why there were even laws and governments. But I heard of the details of vice and bloodshed in wonder, and I turned away with disgust and loathing. He learns about court cases and history, and he learns about people murdering each other. And this is he's like, I couldn't believe that one man would murder another. Remember, this whole thing is being told to Victor up in the mountains, and Victor, remember, coming into this, is convinced that this monster killed his brother. And I think as we read these chapters where the monster tells his narration, some of the most powerful writing in the book, I think we have to start to question ourselves: is this monster capable of murder? This isn't the Frankenstein monster you think of when you think of Halloween masks and legends and things like this. He's a very sympathetic monster. He's a good guy. All he wants is to be part of a family. He loves DeLacy and his family here. And all these lessons, all of this, learning about human history, turns the monster very existential here. And this paragraph that I've highlighted here is key. The words induced me to turn towards myself. I learned that the possessions most esteemed by your fellow creatures were high and unsullied descent, united with riches. A man might be respected with only one of these advantages, but without either, he was considered, except in rare occasions, a vagabond or a slave, doomed to waste his powers and profits for the chosen few. And what was I? Of my creation and creator, I was absolutely ignorant, but I knew that I possessed no money, no friends, no kind of property. I was, besides, endued with a figure hideously deformed and loathsome. I was not even of the same nature of man. I was more agile than they, and could subsist on a coarser diet. I bore the extremes of heat and cold with less injury to my frame. My stature far exceeded from theirs. When I looked around, I saw and heard of none like me. Was I, then, a monster, a blot upon the earth from which all men fled and whom all men disowned? What a paragraph. The monster is like, I listened to these books. I listened to Volney's Ruins of the Empire. I listened to all of these stories, and I was waiting for the chapter where they would tell about my race. They talked about the Romans and the Greeks and the Celtics and the American Indians. Where were the monsters? Where were my race? And yet I existed in none of them. And he's like, the more I learned, the more frustrated I became. What am I? Am I truly a monster? All men will flee from me. All men disown me. Is that my fate? And so the lessons he learns causes even more pain for the monster here. As he listens to these stories, as he listens about history, he keeps looking, where do I belong in this? Where were my friends and relations? No father had watched over my infant days. No mother had blessed me. Here now we're starting to get into the criticism of Victor, who created this monster, then abandoned it, didn't take care of it, which only reinforces this idea that this is a text about young characters who were not supported well by their fathers. Henry Clerval wanted to be a sailor. His father said no, didn't support his dreams. Victor Frankenstein wanted to study alchemy. His father rejected it, said no, you shouldn't do that. Over and over again, this text presents us with one example of another. Caroline needed to be protected by her father Beaufort, but he dies. He falls into poverty, which is why she marries Alphonse in the first place. It's just one story after another of characters being unsupported by their father figures, which at the end of this will tie back to Mary Shelley's own life and her father, William Godwin. So that brings us to the end of 13, a very powerful chapter. Please make sure you read it carefully. There's so much to work with there in 13. In 14, we get a lot of background stuff. Now that the monster can understand the conversations, the monster starts to learn about the family. He learns about DeLacy. He learns all about their background story. He talks about, DeLacy and his family come from Paris. They're Parisians. They come from Paris. They were wealthy. They had all the wealth, all the esteem that goes with that, living in Paris. So, of course, the question you should have is, why is it that they're now poor, living in this hut in the middle of the German forest? This really comes down to Safie. So, what happened here? Seyfi's father is a Turk living in Paris. He was a merchant. And for whatever reason, you could bring in racism here. For whatever reason, Seyfi's father was arrested. He was arrested and convicted of crimes that most people in Paris knew were BS. He was convicted of crimes because, essentially he was a Turk living in Paris, and they sentenced him to death. Um, excuse me. Felix comes across this. Felix, being this young man of social justice, learns about the trial, learns how terrible this was, what was happening to Seyfi's father. He didn't know Seyfi at the time. But again, Felix is like, this is wrong. What they're doing to this man is wrong. He has done nothing. He does not deserve this. And so Felix makes, swears an oath that he is going to help this man. And so Felix does help Seyfi's father escape. And in doing so, the father is so grateful to Felix that, when the father finally introduces Felix to Seyfi, he notices there's an instant attraction between the two. And the father promises to have his daughter marry Felix. Now, Felix didn't do this to marry Seyfi. He wanted to help her father. But, obviously he's not going to object to this. And so in this chapter, Felix helps them escape. And we learn a little bit about Seyfi in this chapter. Seyfi was a Christian Arab. Her mother was Christian. Seyfi has no interest in going back to Turkey and living with her father. She is more of a modern, I don't want to say modern feminist, but she's more into women's rights. She doesn't like the idea of living as an Arab where women were given very little rights. And so Seyfi has no interest in going back with her father. When she meets Felix, who's this Christian, she's all about wanting to marry Felix. And so Felix in this chapter does help Seyfi's father escape from prison. He earns the respect of Seyfi in doing so. But of course, it's found out. The French government finds out that Felix and his family helped them, and DeLacy and his sister Agatha are arrested. They're arrested and they're imprisoned. And over the course of this chapter, obviously Felix now has to go back. He has to, return to try to help his family. He goes back. They are in prison for 5 months. And when they are eventually released, Felix and his family lose everything. They are considered traitors. They lose their wealth. They lose their status, and they are exiled from France, which is why they are now living in the forest in Germany, living in poverty. They've lost everything to help Seyfi's father. Now, Seyfi's father, once he realizes that Felix has lost everything, Seyfi's father has no intention of following through and letting his daughter go and marry Felix. And so he tries to force her to come back to Constantinople with him. He tries to force her to return to live an Arab life, to marry her off to someone else. But Seyfi will not go along with this. Seyfi leaves her father. She makes her way. She finds out through letters where the DeLacy family is living. She makes her journey in this chapter, and she does arrive at DeLacy's house with the full intent of marrying Felix. She abandons her father, and that's how we come to have this Arab woman, the Seyfi, coming to live with this French family in the middle of the forest in Germany, to sit in the hut every day, to listen to DeLacy, to learn these lessons, not knowing that they're secretly being observed by this monster. So chapter 14 lays out the background of the family and why they're living in poverty in the middle of the German forest. So again, I hope this helps. I think the question you should have in your mind here is, learning what we're learning about this monster. A monster who sat in the forest and tried to think about the images here. The monster singing to the birds and how beautiful they are. This monster who chops up wood and leaves it outside DeLacy's house to help the family. This monster who loves these cottagers and just wants to join their family. This monster who feels so alone and remote and isolated. Do you really think it's possible that this monster could be a murderer? Because Victor is convinced. And I'll just leave you with this simple thought. If you are contemplating right now, if you're playing murder mystery and trying to ask yourself, do we really believe the monster committed these murders? I would suggest this. There is actually, at this point in the text, through chapter 14, there is enough evidence for you to know for sure who killed William. You'd have to do a very close reading to understand it, though. And I'll leave you with that. I hope this finds you well. The best to your families as we continue through these times. And I will see you next time.